Now on BBC2 Newsnight.
Good evening. The government sets out its programme for the new session at Westminster. As the Queen opens Parliament, there's the promise of tough measures on law and order, no U-turns on the economy, and the possibility that more privatisation may help make room for tax cuts. But is the government using the law and order issue to divert attention from unemployment and the economy? Joining me to debate that and other questions arising from the Queen's speech are the Home Secretary Douglas Hurd, who will be responsible for 4 new bills this session. Labour's Deputy Leader Roy Hattersley and the Liberal Leader David Steele. Also, will Sunday trading become legal at the 21st parliamentary attempt? 2 of the main protagonists outline the support they think they've got.
The American Secretary of State, George Shultz, returns to Washington from Moscow and plays down hopes for a successful summit. There are, he says, wide differences, especially on arms control. The sculptures of Tony Cragg. We look at his work in the 3rd of our series of profiles of contemporary artists shortlisted for the Turner Prize. And Jarrow remembers 1936. The Queen Mother was there that year. Tomorrow she returns on the 49th anniversary of the day the unemployed men of the town marched on Parliament.
Today's Queen's speech and the arguments now arising from it have made it clear that law and order will rival unemployment and the economy as the dominant issue of the new session of Parliament. The recent riots in inner cities, together with other public concerns about civil disturbance, have led to no fewer than 4 new bills appearing on the legislative timetable for the coming year. The government's economic policy, on the other hand, is to continue down its already familiar path. A path confirmed again only tonight, when the Treasury finally won its public spending battle in the so-called Star Chamber of Ministers. The Queen formally opened the new session today with the traditional gracious speech from the throne, and the MPs who crowded into the Lord's Chamber to hear her were all aware that with the next general election possibly only 2 years away, this could prove to be the second last of these splendid occasions in the life of this present Parliament. The first major policy statement in the speech concerned the economy and gave the first indication of this new parliamentary session that there's to be no basic change in the government's approach.
Within the framework of firm monetary and fiscal policies designed to secure a continuing reduction in inflation, my government will do all in their power to encourage the growth of new jobs. Firm control of public expenditure will be maintained, with a view to income tax.
So a renewed commitment there to a further cut in income tax. As to encouraging the growth of new jobs, the government still has high hopes of liberalising and deregulating the economy. Reforming wages councils, which currently set minimum pay, and allowing shops to open on Sunday are 2 new measures to that end. Another will be more privatisation.
My government will pursue vigorously their programme of privatisation as a means both of improving the efficiency of the industries concerned and of encouraging wider share ownership.
Of the new candidates for privatisation announced today, the biggest is the British Gas Corporation. This alone could raise more than £8 billion. Also up for sale will be the British Airports Authority, which runs 7 major airports, including Heathrow and Gatwick. That could fetch another £500 million. Other public bodies already in the pipeline are British Airways and the National Bus Company. Another major piece of legislation will be the reform of the welfare state. The government announced its outline proposals to shake up social services last June and ran into strong opposition, especially over plans to abolish the State Earnings-Related Pension Scheme, or SERPS. Now that's expected to be partly reprieved when the White Paper is introduced, probably before Christmas. The 4th major preoccupation for Parliament will be law and order.
Measures will be introduced to strengthen the powers of the police in combating disorder, to modernise and codify the common law public order offences in England and Wales, and to provide the courts in England and Wales with power to confiscate the proceeds of drug trafficking and to penalise the handling of such proceeds.
After riots in Britain's cities, violence on picket lines and disorder on football terraces, the government is increasing police powers. And a new public order bill will create a new offence of disorderly conduct designed to tackle hooliganism. In the fight against drugs, a radical new measure will mean that anyone convicted of drug trafficking may have all his assets seized, unless he can prove these weren't acquired as a result of the drug trade. Parliament will also consider proposals for teachers to be appraised regularly and for parents to be put on schools' governing bodies. Then there are plans to increase the sales of council flats to tenants and to give building societies more freedom to diversify. Finally, the government is proposing a new system to police the city and other financial institutions. There was no mention in the Queen's speech of a bill on the government's long-awaited plans for reforming the local government rating system, though in the Commons this afternoon, Mrs Thatcher said the government would be publishing proposals for a major reform. That could mean no rates legislation for England and Wales, though the government has already indicated that it is considering enacting separate rates reform for Scotland before the next election. Opening the 6-day Commons debate on the Queen's speech this afternoon, the Labour leader, Neil Kinnock, vigorously attacked the government's record and policies. Britain was now an insecure society, he said, and he accused the Prime Minister of misreading the mood of British taxpayers.
It's not only the poor who want the relief of poverty in this decent country. It's not only the homeless who want the government to commence a new house-building programme. And it's not only the jobless who want the government to combat unemployment. Those are now national demands, the product of a climate of care and a climate of conscience and constructive attitudes. It's not bleeding heart do-gooding. It's the realistic response of millions of people in this country who know that division and decay impoverishes and demeans and endangers the whole of our society.
For her part, the Prime Minister lambasted the opposition's attitude towards law and order, and also Labour's plans to increase public spending, which, she claimed, would lead to savage tax increases.
It is the wealth creators who are the job creators. All economic policies must be designed as a spur to the wealth creators, whether they be brilliant scientists, skilled tradesmen, talented designers, or shrewd managers who know the marketplace, or young people with the ideas and initiative to start up on their own. And those who set out to penalise wealth creators, whether by punitive taxation or too much red tape, are really penalising those who are looking for jobs.
As for the Liberal leader, David Steele, he accused the government of not tackling the main issues.
This is fundamentally a tinkering Queen's speech. It doesn't go to the heart of the problem. It is all presentation. And the government, in rejecting all these other people's views, reminds me a little of the Victorian embroidery that I remember seeing on the wall of an elderly couple in my constituency. And I can imagine the Prime Minister saying it to the Chancellor: "All the world's wrong save thee and me, and even these a little wrong."
Well, that's how the frontbenchers responded to the gracious speech today. For an assessment of how the speech was received on the backbenches and the general mood tonight of MPs, John Cole, our political editor, is at Westminster. John, what is the general mood down there now?
Well, Donald, we're a year nearer a general election than we were at this time last year when we had a Queen's speech, and so it's quite clear it's going to be an extremely fierce session. From today's events, one can see that the parties, both the government party and the opposition parties, are really raring to go at the election campaign already, and I suspect it is going to be a very combative session, both over the subject of law and order, which is the subject of a good deal of government legislation, and also, of course, over the economy and particularly unemployment.
On the Conservative side in particular, John, is it felt that the government has shown that its radical reforming credentials are still intact at the beginning of this new session or not?
Oh yes, I think the Conservative backbenchers are satisfied enough that Mrs Thatcher is pushing on with things like privatisation, of which they approve. But there is a fair amount of anxiety about the economy. They would like to be surer that the unemployment figures are going to turn down. And there was a certain feeling, I think, that Mrs. Thatcher's speech was a bit defensive. Now, that was partly because she got a very heavy cold and there was some difficulty in the Conservative side with the loudspeakers. But nevertheless, 6 years into a government, a Prime Minister is a pretty difficult speech to make on this occasion, and I think it was inevitably defending her record rather than advocating new policies, because clearly she's not going to change her economic policies in any substantial way.
On the other hand, John, you were saying earlier on the 9 o'clock news that Neil Kinnock today, in his opening speech on the Queen's speech, showed a new command of the House of Commons.
Yes, well, I think he's gained in self-confidence after his performance at his party conference in Bournemouth. He had a bit of good luck at the beginning today because the Speaker made a mistake and called him as the Prime Minister, and of course he made a joke out of that and got a lot of laughs. That got him off to a good start. He made a very combative speech and his own side were very pleased with it, and the Conservatives gave him a comparatively quiet ride, whereas the Labour benches were very rough with Mrs. Thatcher.
John, in the meantime, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, that's how the Commons has received the Queen's speech, but what about tomorrow's papers? In particular, what did the leader writers make of it all? One of the warmest receptions is given by the Financial Times. It notes the absence of measures on employment and the inner cities, but feels the ship is on course.
The government has plainly not yet run out of ideas, nor out of its original radical reforming zeal.
A view of the speech which finds the Daily Telegraph in disagreement.
It reflects, rather inevitably, the emptiness of the June 1983 manifesto. If vote-winning rabbits are to be produced from hats, they'll come not from anything in the speech, but from Mr. Lawson and his 1986 budget, with its promised hints of income tax cuts.
However, it's the firm measures on public order which preoccupy many of the leader writers. The Daily Mail says that
seldom can there have been a Queen's speech closer to the gut concern of the people. It is not the Tories who have put public order and drug-related crime at the top of the national agenda. It is the thugs and hooligans.
But for the Daily Mirror, that's only half the story. The paper also blames Mrs. Thatcher's approach and policy.
Her philosophy is a convenient get-out for a government which won't spend money on the social problems which its policies have helped to create.
That's a view which The Guardian forcibly underlines in criticising the public order proposal.
It is a cheap, dangerous and extremely discreditable exercise aimed at diverting attention from the administration's failure on jobs, its ditherings over the welfare state and the demonstrable irrelevance of its solutions to crime and violence. It doesn't deserve to work.
With me now are three senior frontbenchers from the main parties, including the Home Secretary, Douglas Hurd. Mr. Hurd, as the man who will be responsible for putting through no fewer than 4 new bills in the new session of Parliament, how do you react to the Guardian's criticism there that really the law and order issue, as propounded by the government, is an attempt to divert attention from unemployment and the economy?
I've never heard anything so silly. And we didn't create the drugs problem. The drugs problem is real. What we are proposing is that the assets of drug traffickers, once they're convicted, should be confiscated. Is the Guardian saying we've dreamt that up, or is any sensible person going to oppose that? On public order, the Guardian, everybody knows perfectly well that a public order bill tidying up the law, modernising the law on public order, has been on the stocks for some time. Now it's ready, we're going to introduce it, and it'll do a lot of good.
Roy Hattersley, for the Labour Party, do you accept that whether you think it's desirable or not, the law and order issue is now a main one to rival even unemployment?
Well, the government are trying to make it so. The government's information organisation today has been saying to newspapers, this is really all about law and order, that is the issue of the year. And I think it's certainly now the second most important issue facing Britain. But I don't think we can think about it in terms of the group of 4 bills if they're all the same. Very clearly what the government proposes on drugs is right and necessary and a worldwide problem which the opposition will help to solve by facilitating the passage of that bill as best we can. The other bills are dealing with the symptom of a problem when the government ought to be dealing with the cause. And I think it's in part an intention, a hope, of diverting public attention away from the crisis in the economy and the failure to combat unemployment. But it's also an attempt to divert public opinion away from the government's own failures over law and order. This government, elected as a law and order government, has presided over a 40% increase in crime. More crimes committed, fewer crimes actually cleared up. And the government's very sensitive to that, and I think much of the huffing and puffing is to divert attention from their own failure.
Do you agree with that, David Steele?
Yes, I'm not so worried about the content of the Queen's speech on the law and order front, because I think surely we're all looking for ways to improve the law and order position, and certainly the legislation on drugs is something that we have pressed for and which, like the Labour Party, we will support. On the public order aspect, I think we want to be convinced that there is a case for a new public order offence, but we're not going to be obstructive about that. What worries me much more was the tone of the Prime Minister's remarks today. I think we're entering a new situation if, in fact, the role of the police starts to become a party political football. And she made a very combative speech, more or less suggesting that the Labour Party were anti-police. Now, I know a number of very foolish statements have been made by individual Labour politicians on the police, but I don't actually think the Labour Party, as the official opposition, is anti-police. And I think it's ridiculous to draw them into that position. And the further thing, which I mentioned in my own speech this afternoon, is that there is a risk to society as a whole if we start to put the police into positions of conflict which we as politicians have failed to resolve. That happened last year a lot with the miners' dispute, and it's happened in our inner cities. And I think we've got to be very careful that we don't make the police a political football.
In spite of what you said at the beginning, Mr. Hurd, did the tone of what the Prime Minister had to say effectively put law and order, make it a political football?
No, the Prime Minister said, as we've all said, that without public order, without peace in the streets, all the other things we argue about, employment, housing and so on, are vain. They don't work. What she was saying about the Labour Party is something very precise and important, that there are, particularly in London, unfortunately, people and organisations using the Labour name, using the resources, prestige of the Labour Party, to rubbish the police, to undermine and harass all those who cooperate with the police, particularly blacks nations. Now that is a mischief, that is a thoroughly bad thing, and we, as part of the general effort to mobilise people against crime, we do ask the Labour Party and the Labour leadership to deal with that evil.
Roy Hattersley, you must have come back on that.
Well, it's simply demeaning for the Prime Minister to behave in this way. I mean, there is a real problem. I repeat the figures, the problem of 40% increase in crime during the 6 years of her government. A problem with more crimes committed and fewer crimes cleared up. Now, what is the Prime Minister's response to this? Not as it should be, to attack the causes of crime, which are in part poverty, which are in part unemployment, which are in part deprivation, but in a particularly strident way to shout that individual Labour Party councillors are somewhere responsible for this. I repeat, I think it's demeaning for a Prime Minister to behave in that way, and I think it's deeply dangerous to a democracy. If there was a real enthusiasm on the Tory party's part for reducing the crime rate rather than scoring points, they'd be trying to get a consensus in the House of Commons. What the Prime Minister tried to do today was to divide the House of Commons, and will not solve the crime wave in that way.
Douglas Hurd, isn't it true that by going for revising the law in several respects, as Roy Hattersley said earlier, you are attacking the symptoms and not the cause?
No, I think you have to deal with crime as if it were committed by criminals, and you have to deal with disorder by strengthening the powers of the police, where that has been shown by the Law Commission, by other independent people, to be necessary. But we'll argue that through in the House of Commons. It doesn't mean that we're neglecting the other things. It doesn't mean that we refuse to learn the lessons of what has happened as regards deprivation and so on. These are evils in themselves which need to be tackled. There's been no shortage of public money going into Handsworth, Tottenham, Lambeth and so on. The question we have to ask ourselves, the question David Steele asked in the House of Commons is that money being spent in the best way? And one of the things we now have to do is to make sure that it is. And if it isn't, shift it so that it is.
David Steele?
Well, the point I was making in my speech is that there is some evidence that the money we've spent in the past in those inner cities has not been spent in the most productive way. But the point I want to get back to is if you look at the criminal statistics of the last 5 years, 6 years, the fact is that within the overall increase in crime, there has been a massive increase, a savage increase in robberies and burglaries. Now, what we ought to be asking ourselves is what is it that has caused this great upsurge in crimes of property? And I think that it must be in some way related to the fact that so many of our young people, particularly in the inner city areas, are engaged in enforced idleness. And there's no use getting away from that. And therefore, any government has got to have a programme to get people back to work, to get people usefully occupied in order to tackle the crime.
Well, just before we go on to the economic questions, which David Steele is guiding us towards, really, does the government accept or not, Douglas Hurd, that unemployment and deprivation do have a direct link, however big, however small, with the kind of inner city law and order concerns that the public have?
About a third of the people so far charged after the riots in Brixton, some of them were terrible crimes, had jobs by their own account, perfectly good jobs. The looting was not the looting by people who were really hard up looking for food to feed their families. They were looking for things which they could sell quickly, videos and tellies. So I think that before we fall too quickly into the argument that it's unemployment which causes crime, it's deprivation which causes crime, we need to look actually on the ground at what is actually happening. And Roy Hattersley knows Birmingham very well. I found, when I went to Birmingham after the riots, that people of all persuasions, political persuasions in Birmingham, were agreed at that moment that these were overwhelmingly criminal events. They might have deeper causes to some extent, but they were overwhelmingly criminal events. And what we're saying in this part of our programme is that you do need actually to strengthen the law and, where necessary, the police to deal with that.
What do you want the government to be doing about the cause, the underlying causes it's not doing?
One point absolutely clear. What happened in Handsworth in Birmingham, which you know a little about, was generally criminality, and I was the first politician to denounce it as criminality.
Correct.
And I'm not wanting in any way the police to be tender on those people who committed appalling acts against property and against individuals, committed murder against individuals. I think it's possible to argue. And I want the police to take a strong line. What I find extraordinary is the government keeps asking us to choose between the police taking a strong line and, on the other hand, dealing with the causes of the actions. I don't know why we can't have the police taking a strong line against the criminal acts and assault the cause at the same time. And what I must ask Douglas Hurd is two questions.
We want to get on to the economy, Mr. Hattersley, as well.
On both these, the two things are related. I mean, why is it that we have acts like Handsworth in areas of 50% male unemployment, but we don't have them in Oxfordshire or Buckinghamshire or Bedfordshire? And if there is a connection between the prosperity in the second area and the lack of prosperity in the first, what is the government doing about Handsworth and areas like that in terms of their prosperity?
On the unemployment issue, David Steele, are you entirely convinced that the government's approach, as we've said earlier, of deregulation, privatisation and tax cuts is not going to deliver falling unemployment by the time of the next election?
No, it isn't. Let me just add one sentence, if I may, on this criminality point, because of course there is criminality there, that we're all agreed on. The point is that we ought to be trying, as politicians, to remove the breeding ground on which the criminals thrive. Absolutely. And that's what the government's failing to do. Now, I don't believe, and this is my central criticism of the Queen's speech, in answer to your question, I don't believe that these measures, privatisation and so on, very interesting to spread share ownership, I'm all in favour of it, but they do not get to the central issue, which is that the reports that have been coming out from the CBI, from the Chambers of Commerce, from the Select Committee in the House of Lords, pointing out how our manufacturing base is shrinking. What is the government going to do once they've sold off all the public assets? How are they going to raise the money then? What's happening after oil resources have gone? And the government is not addressing itself to the central issue of improving Britain's manufacturing base in order not just to cure the criminality, but in order to strengthen our economy for the years that are ahead.
Well, we are, of course, more jobs have been created in this country over the last couple of years than in the whole of the rest of Europe. Jobs, and they're not the same jobs, they're not smokestack jobs in Handsworth and Tottenham, and some of them are jobs in Whitney. And that's one reason, no doubt, why we have a fragile situation, a tense situation in some of our inner cities. You're not going to solve that by throwing new money into old mistakes. That's why I'm sure the first thing we have to do is not to deny the deprivation or the need to do something about it, but to make sure that the very large sums of money, the millions that have been put into the inner cities, are actually going in the right directions, are actually properly targeted, and that's what we're doing.
How are you going to get unemployment down?
Well, you may have noticed that in the last figures we're actually down.
Mildly encouraging only, Lord Young said.
Mildly encouraging is all any sensible person would say. But don't count us out of the ring on this before we are.
Well, the Queen's speech doesn't even make any promises or hopes or aspirations about
because we don't believe you get jobs by passing new laws.
Other Queen's speeches have said that the government hopes for reduction in unemployment. This Queen's speech did not. And really, the government's attempt to divert attention from unemployment to employment is really bogus in two ways. We have now in this country 1 million less jobs than when this government was in power. I mean, it's not simply unemployment that's gone up, it's the number of jobs that's fallen. Douglas Hurd reduces the figures offered to him by Conservative Central Office that things have turned from disaster to a catastrophe in the last 2 years. But over the 6 years of their government, they have lost 1 million jobs, and they're not going to make those up before the next general election.
It's also rather unusual, I think, for a Queen's speech to anticipate the budget to the extent of saying that it's part of the programme for the year to reduce income tax. Now, I think if you ask most people in the street, would you rather have a higher standard of education, of health service, of housing repair, more people back at work, which involves spending public money, or income tax cuts? I think the general mood of this country is to say we want to see our services maintained, we want to see unemployment cut, and we'd be prepared to forgo income tax cuts, which all of us would like to have in an ideal world, in order to improve the social prospects in our country and reduce the divisions and the bitterness.
Or finally,
yes.
As Neil Kinnock was putting the same point earlier, Mr. Hurd, Mrs. Thatcher and the government and yourself have got the British taxpayer wrong.
I think that's because people, including Roy Hattersley, create the impression that tax cuts are something which benefit only the rich. Now, you only have to look at the payslip of a nurse or a teacher to know that that's not so, and that really the kind of people who we want to help are still paying large sums in tax. And a sensible way of dealing with that is, in fact, to reduce income tax, as the Queen's speech indicated we try to do. We haven't been able to make as much progress as we want. That's not a reason for not making more now.
Not only
Mr.
haven't
Hurd,
they made any progress, they've put up taxes by £29 billion.
Mr. Hurd, Mr. Hattersley, Mr. Steele, thanks all very much indeed. And in a few minutes, we'll actually be returning to the Queen's speech and to one bill which is likely to cause some of the most heated debates of this session. Here, the proponents and opponents of Sunday trading will be putting their case. But first, with the rest of today's news, Jenny.
In South Africa, the police have reported the first deaths since journalists were banned from covering the unrest. They said 2 black men were shot dead near Cape Town when violence broke out at a funeral. Also in the Cape Town area, a soldier was found shot dead, and the anti-apartheid campaigner, Alan Bosak, appeared in court accused of entering a black township without permission. The Liverpool Labour Party has said tonight it's prepared to consider a modest rate increase as a way of solving the city's current financial crisis. The figure mentioned of about 5% still falls short of the 15% rate rise recommended by the independent Stonefrost inquiry into the city's finances. But the Stonefrost report was not rejected outright tonight, as some reports had predicted after statements by Derek Hatton, Liverpool's deputy leader, at the weekend. Ireland's Deputy Prime Minister Dick Spring and the Foreign Minister Peter Barry were in London today for talks on the Anglo-Irish summit over Northern Ireland. They met the Foreign Secretary Geoffrey Howe and the Northern Ireland Secretary Tom King. The trip is believed to be the last meeting of ministers before the summit. A meeting between the National Union of Mine Workers and TUC leaders ended today without any decision on the threat posed to the NUM by the new breakaway union. The TUC is to have further talks with the NUM to see if anything can be done to bring unity to the coalfields. Tonight, 3 police forces, London, Surrey and Wiltshire, are involved in a joint effort to trace the killer of Jackie Murray, whose body was dumped in Hyde Park on Monday. Detectives believe there could be a link between her murder, the M4 rape case, and an attack on a teenage girl at Ashstead in Surrey. Abroad again now to Washington, and the return of the American Secretary of State, George Shultz, from pre-summit talks at the Kremlin has set back hopes in the States. There are wide differences, he said, especially on arms control. And Vitaly Yushchenko, the Soviet spy who changed his mind about defecting to America, has begun his journey home to Russia. President Reagan said today that his defection and other recent incidents involving 2 Soviet citizens may have been part of an orchestrated campaign. The Polish leader, General Jaruzelski, today officially resigned as Prime Minister. He's been appointed state president in a speedy move which ensures he'll remain a dominant political figure. He's been replaced by his former deputy, Zbigniew Messner. Tomorrow, the Queen Mother visits Jarrow on Tyneside to open a coal shipping centre. Almost 50 years ago, she visited the town to open a similar plant. That was 1936. And within weeks, the 200 Jarrow marchers protesting at 80% unemployment set off to make their presence felt at the state opening of Parliament. The new centre has cost £11.5 million, but will bring only 30 or 50 jobs to Jarrow. As Parliament opens for 1986, 1 in every 3 people in Jarrow is out of work. Today, Jarrow wants both to remember and forget its past.
It's a nice place, Jarrow, really. Bred and born in Jarrow.
What's so nice about it?
Well, it's a nice little centre, really. There's nothing to it, like you can go around it in 5 minutes. But I still like it. I mean, when you've been bred and born here, you get used to it, don't you?
Is that one take?
No, it's slack now. That's all right. That's perfect.
You will throw a switch to activate the plant, which in fact is the same switch as she used to open the Jarrow staith in 1936. When she throws this switch, the Royal Marine Band, which will be here, will sound the fanfare, and there will then be a short video film shown before Her Majesty the Queen Mother and the guests, which will show the working of the plant from the arrival of coal right through the loading of the ship.
I can remember when the Queen Mother came to open the Jarrow staiths. In fact, the wife and I went to see her, and there was thousands beside us went to see her.
But suddenly, the shipyard was closed and the steelworks were closed. This was calamitous for the town.
Gunnin' doon, Geordie, gunnin' doon, to the tune where the power lies. Gunnin' doon, Geordie, gunnin' doon, pit your wits, Geordie, chuck your eye.
The Jarrow March was very much the first media hype. And this was an important thing because it was organised in that way. It wasn't a hunger march, it wasn't a load of bedraggled men walking to London. It was very carefully organised. The men were dressed well, they were fed well, and the reporters were very keen to look at the rather heroic aspect of this march. But it did create a symbolic, heroic element which actually belied the truth.
It was an experience for me, an experience, because really that was the first time I'd ever been away from home. And I was a bit scary at first being there because I had 60 young children. I remember the good feeding we got when we got to the towns we were going to, first of all. I can remember that, damn good feeding. And the likes of you people in newspapers called it a hunger march. It was never a hunger march. It was a crusade looking for work. No more, no less.
They were interested in getting a job. They were interested in succour for their families. And that was their feeling as they went along on this 300-mile march.
The Jarrow Petition, a petition to the government for work for the thousands of unemployed in what is probably the hardest hit town in Britain, is being carried to London by the 200 members of the Jarrow Crusade.
When they went to the house, and all the accounts seemed to suggest that the men stood in the gallery and they looked down at the petition being presented, they didn't. The men were served tea in an antechamber. Some of them went on a trip down the river. And indeed, I think there was a reason they weren't in that gallery, because, again, there were political platitudes going on in the House. Nothing was being promised. The petition was presented, and then anticlimax.
There was general disappointment that there was no substantial outcome of this protest. And the men returned to Jarrow by train on the Monday, feeling that while they've been able to bring to the nation's notice their very special plight, they did not have much to look forward to.
I think it should be forgotten now. I mean, not the men to be forgotten, that march. They've done it for a good cause. But they can't say that they brought anything to the modern age Jarrow like in a certain way.